Janitorial staff should use the back entrance, not the priority lane. A wealthy traveler wrinkled his nose as Julia Mason stepped into the check-in line. Pale shirt, flat shoes, and old backpack slung over her shoulder. "You looking to clean the first-class lounge?" A young flight attendant laughed loud enough for the crowd. Stares fell on her from all directions. Julia said nothing. They didn't know the woman they were mocking was the captain of their flight. She kept her posture still, her shoulders relaxed as though the taunts didn't graze her. Several people in the line glanced at her backpack, noting its faded corners and the old aviation patch barely visible under layers of wear. One man edged his luggage cart away from her, as if distancing himself from an unfamiliar presence. A mother with two restless children peered over, then averted her eyes. Julia stayed quiet, taking in every detail as the queue inched forward. The holiday rush made tempers flare and security officers barked instructions at travelers rummaging for passports. The wealthy passenger who first called out returned to scanning his phone, but every so often he'd look her way, the corners of his mouth twisting in mild disdain. Next to him, the flight attendant pretended to busy herself with a tablet, but her snickers carried. Julia eased her weight from one foot to the other, maintaining that measured calm she had cultivated for years. She was used to crossing airport thresholds under multiple guises, used to hearing judgments from strangers who saw only worn clothes and an old bag. But behind that backpack's tattered seams and her neat braided hair was a presence that had navigated skies beyond their imagination. As the line advanced, a gate agent stood by scanning boarding passes. The wealthy passenger strolled past him with a commanding air, ignoring the staff's friendly greeting. When it was Julia's turn, the agent gave her a cursory glance, then paused at her ID, noticing the mismatch between her humble attire and the calm authority in her eyes. He opened his mouth as if to ask a question, then changed his mind. People behind Julia grew impatient, so the agent waved her through. She stepped around a small child chasing a rolling suitcase, her back straight, gaze forward. The flight attendant who'd jeered at her was already halfway down the concourse, giggling into her phone, pointing in Julia's direction as she whispered something to a colleague. On any other day, that might have earned a raised eyebrow. But Julia's expression stayed as even as the horizon at cruising altitude, steady, unwavering. Security lay ahead, thick with travelers unloading laptops and liquids into trays. A rumble of frustration spread whenever someone took too long. Julia joined the line, gently setting her backpack on the belt, slipping out of her flats and stepping onto the cold floor. A bored security officer kept glancing at her scuffed shoes and well-worn shirt as though expecting trouble. The wealthy traveler, now a few paces ahead, turned to smirk, catching the moment. One of the security staff pointed to a separate lane designated for priority or airline crew, but when Julia stepped toward it, another guard stepped directly in front, raising a palm. "Ma'am, that lane is for crew only," he said, voice devoid of courtesy. She nodded, returning to her place in the general line. The guard's eyes flicked over her posture, unimpressed. People behind her shuffled, exchanging looks that implied she'd tried to break rules. Julia didn't bother defending herself. She gathered her belongings from the conveyor after the scan, ignoring the hush around her that spoke of contempt disguised as impatience. Leaving security, she navigated toward the corridor that branched into lounges. A sign read Crew Lounge above a discreet doorway. She paused, noticing a uniformed guard stationed there. He eyed her with the same dismissive hostility she'd faced at security. "This area is for flight personnel only," he said, unmoving. "If you're lost, go to the information desk." She stood there, her gaze drifting to the plaque on the door. For a fleeting moment, her hand brushed against a small patch hidden beneath her coat, her pilot's ID. Still, she made no move to argue. The guard looked away, deciding that she posed no real threat, just another misguided soul. Behind her footsteps approached a group of male pilots with crisp white shirts and stripes on their shoulders. They carried their jackets over one arm, talking loudly about flight schedules and complaining about the holiday rush. Spotting Julia, they traded grins. "Maintenance staff isn't allowed in the cockpit," one quipped, eyeing her old backpack. Another snorted in agreement. They breezed past this guard, who nodded respectfully to them. Julia waited a second, then continued on without a word, letting them vanish into the lounge. She turned in the opposite direction, heading deeper into the terminal. The corridors widened, bustling with crowds scanning departure boards. Children tugged at parents' sleeves, exhausted travelers rested on benches near charging stations, and overhead announcements warned of delays. Julia's presence faded into the throng, unremarkable except for those few who had witnessed her earlier humiliation. She made her way toward Gate 26A, stepping around travelers lost in their phones. A faint memory tugged at her senses years ago. She'd walked these halls in a janitor's uniform, picking up discarded coffee cups and wiping seat arms. She had worn a name badge, but no one read it. They only saw a cleaning person invisible. That recollection surfaced unannounced like a quiet echo, then dissolved as she approached the gate. At Gate 26A, a cluster of ground crew scurried about preparing for boarding. The wealthy traveler from the security line stood at the priority queue, scanning his watch. Several first-class passengers hovered near him, trading jaded comments about delayed flights. Nearby, the same flight attendant who had mocked Julia eyed the board's board. Another group of uniformed pilots chatted near the window, their jackets folded neatly on chairs. They showed each other flight schedules on laminated rosters, oblivious to her presence. Julia remained by a pillar out of their line of sight, her backpack resting at her feet. The announcement sounded overhead. "We regret to inform that flight AC-601 is temporarily delayed. We appreciate your patience." A mild groan drifted through the crowd. Julia gazed at the plane through the window, an aircraft she knew intimately from cockpit to tail. She watched ground technicians loading luggage recognize the subtle cues that indicated final checks were almost complete. Outside, a rolling sky hinted at potential storms, the kind that could challenge even the best pilots. She exhaled slowly, letting the swirl of travelers' frustration pass by her. Moments later, a gate agent picked up the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, flight AC-601 to Lisbon is ready for boarding. Priority passengers may proceed." People in the waiting area stirred. The wealthy passenger straightened his jacket, smirking at those he perceived as lesser. The flight attendant stifled a yawn, glancing around to see if the assigned captain was present. The male pilots waiting across the corridor frowned at their phones. Apparently they were not assigned to AC-601 after all, just passing by. The gate agent repeated, "Flight AC-601 is now boarding rows 110. Confusion spread. Where was the captain? A pause settled. Then an overhead call. "Captain Julia Mason, please proceed to the flight deck for pre-flight check." Heads turned sharply. The wealthy traveler whipped his gaze around. The flight attendant blinked. A hush fell as passengers wondered who Captain Mason was. That hush deepened when Julia stepped forward from her corner, lifted a folded navy jacket from her backpack and slipped it on. She reached inside the bag for a weathered pilot's cap, the fabric worn from use but still bearing her rank insignia. With a calm, purposeful movement, she placed it on her braided hair. Her posture shifted, no longer that of a quiet bystander, but of someone used to commanding an aircraft at 30,000 feet. The crowd realized with a jolt that the same woman they had derided stood revealed as their captain. Stunned faces turned her way, the hush turning to a fraught silence. The flight attendant's eyes went wide, her earlier laughter drowned in disbelief. The guard from the lounge hovered at the edge of the gate area, face pale. He seemed to recall, blocking her path. The wealthy traveler parted his lips as if to speak, but no words emerged. Even the ground crew paused in their tasks, some staring through the glass. Julia offered no dramatic speech. She simply adjusted the brim of her cap, approached the podium, and spoke to the gate agent in a low murmur. The agent nodded, letting her pass through the gate door onto the jet bridge. The tension in the air crackled. Passengers parted as she walked by. She carried the same old backpack, but now everyone saw the wings pinned to her jacket, the quiet authority in her stance. She disappeared into the corridor leading to the cockpit, leaving the crowd to exchange shocked glances. Inside the cockpit, Julia set down her bag and began her checks. The first officer, who had never met her in person, greeted her with a brief flicker of surprise, then smiled. He introduced himself quickly, flipping through flight paperwork. She nodded, scanning the day's flight plan, verifying weather data. Outside, ground crews finalized fueling. She watched from the cockpit window as the last suitcases rolled up the conveyor. Over the radio, the cabin crew requested final clearance for passenger boarding. Julia keyed her mic voice calm. "This is Captain Mason performing pre-flight checks. Stand by." Her attention turned to the instrument panel. She ran through each switch, each gauge with practiced efficiency. There was no trace of the passers-by's insults on her face, only the unflinching focus of a pilot. Boarding completed, the cabin crew signaled all passengers seated. Julia nodded at the first officer, who informed her they were cleared to push back. She toggled the PA system. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Mason speaking. We'll be departing shortly, heading to Lisbon. Expected flight time is 6 hours. We might see some weather en route, but nothing we can't handle. Please relax, and thanks for choosing to fly with us." She paused, then switched off the mic. The image of those stunned faces at the gate crept into her mind, but she banished it. A pilot's duty overshadowed personal grievances. The aircraft taxied out onto the runway. The engines roared to life, that deep hum of power fueling her sense of purpose. The first officer announced final checks, and tower control cleared them for takeoff. Julia's hands on the throttle were steady, guiding the plane forward. In the cockpit, there was no sign of the earlier humiliations, only the hum of instruments and the crisp dance of professional collaboration. Once airborne, the plane climbed through scattered clouds. The Atlantic horizon stretched ahead in a cold, clean line. Julia set the autopilot, verifying coordinates. Then she settled into the routine of monitoring flight systems, exchanging updates with the first officer, and keeping an eye on the shifting weather patterns. The flight attendant who had mocked her was now somewhere behind the cockpit door, tending to passengers. 2 hours later, as they approached the midpoint of the ocean crossing, turbulence began to rattle the plane. Julia received a weather update, an unexpected pressure system forming ahead more severe than forecast. The cockpit lights flickered with each jostle. Oxygen masks trembled overhead. The first officer shot her a worried glance. She unbuckled, leaned forward to adjust the radar, scanning for a gap in the storm system. Outside, the sky grew dark, violent with swirling clouds. The intercom crackled with anxious voices from the cabin crew, reporting frightened passengers, some nearing panic. Julia responded with calm instructions for them to remain seated, seatbelts secured. As the turbulence worsened, the plane lurched. Overhead bins popped open. The seatbelt sign flashed madly. The first officer struggled with the yoke, but Julia's experience took the lead. She rechecked the altimeter, the weather radar, and decided on an emergency descent to a lower altitude where the air might be calmer. Her voice on the PA was steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing unexpected, severe turbulence. Please remain in your seats with belts fastened. We have everything under control." She felt the plane shudder under the storm's grip, but her grip on the controls was sure, every muscle memory gleaned from countless flight hours. One engine gauge blinked red momentarily, an electrical glitch triggered by the jostling. She cross-checked with backups. The plane needed immediate stabilization, so she initiated the descent, steering them beneath the tumultuous cloud layer. The cabin roared with the noise of wind shear overhead vents spitting intermittent bursts of air. Passengers, many in near panic, clutched their armrests, some crying out. Julia's voice remained composed, guiding the first officer through each step. She had studied storms far worse in simulator sessions, had flown through close calls in her early days. The plane broke through the thick cloud, emerging into clearer skies a few thousand feet lower. The difference in turbulence was noticeable, but not enough to relax. She requested an alternate runway at a coastal airport well short of Lisbon, deciding it's safer to land than push on. The first officer relayed the plan to air traffic control. Julia angled the plane toward the backup runway, scanning the horizon for any break in the weather. Everyone in the cabin could feel the flight's shift. Instead of continuing across the Atlantic, they were now veering away from the main path. The flight attendant who had sneered at Julia earlier found herself reassuring frightened passengers, her own face pale with fear. The wealthy traveler huddled in his seat, white-knuckled, no sign of arrogance left. Masks dangled from compartments overhead. Some passengers had them pressed to their faces. The entire plane pinned its hopes on the calm captain's voice, crackling over the intercom. Julia navigated with unyielding focus, glancing only briefly at the first officer's updates. Ahead, the distant runway lights glimmered through a haze of rain. She eased the plane lower, the wings shivering in gusts. Each meter of descent tested her skill, but she never let panic slip into her voice. Her instructions to the cabin were clipped and clear, her communication with the tower seamless. The final approach was a fight against crosswinds, the aircraft swaying. The runway loomed. Julia eased the throttles, flared the nose at just the right moment, and let the plane touch down with a jolt. A wave of relief rippled through the cabin as the wheels screeched on wet tarmac, the plane decelerating. Fire engines and emergency vehicles lined the runway, lights flashing. But the crisis was over. She'd safely landed 340 souls out of a raging storm. Once the plane taxied to a halt, paramedics entered to assist any shaken passengers. Overhead lights returned to normal. People unbuckled, some crying in relief. The flight attendant whispered apologies to them, her earlier brashness gone. The wealthy traveler slumped in his seat, color returning to his cheeks. Up front, Julia completed the post-landing checks, her calm presence anchoring the first officer's frayed nerves. Control tower staff congratulated them on a masterful emergency descent. She offered only a quiet thank you in return, powering down the engines. She made a final PA announcement. "We've arrived at an alternate airport for your safety. Thank you for your cooperation. Please remain seated until further notice." The calm in her tone belied the adrenaline that must have surged through her. The next morning, headlines flourished across local news and aviation channels. "Unassuming female pilot prevents. Mid-Atlantic disaster," read one. "Captain Julia Mason, calm courage in the storm," read another. Photos surfaced of the plane on the backup runway, emergency crews standing by. Julia's name was in every article, praised for decisive action that saved hundreds of lives. People in the airport lounge saw the bulletins on TV screens, recognized her face from the coverage. The flight attendant who had once scorned her read those lines in silence, guilt churning. The wealthy traveler, presumably too embarrassed to speak, stayed out of the limelight. But word spread among the staff the woman they ridiculed for her shabby outfit and old backpack was the pilot who handled a crisis that might have ended in tragedy. When Julia returned to the original airport, the atmosphere had shifted. She walked through the concourse in the same pale shirt, though now wearing her flight jacket loosely over it and her old backpack. But this time, security officers who recognized her name from the news stepped aside respectfully, no longer scanning her with suspicion. The lounge guard who once blocked her path now lowered his head as she passed. A few gate agents who had witnessed the meltdown pulled their faces taut with shame. Even the male pilots who had teased her fumbled for words, murmuring a greeting that conveyed genuine admiration. She responded with a slight nod, no animosity. The hush they felt was the hush of respect newly earned, etched in regret. At a corner of the terminal, the wealthy traveler, still waiting for an onward flight, spotted Julia approaching. The man stared for a moment, then mustered enough courage to step toward her. He looked her in the eye. "I'm sorry," he managed, voice subdued. She watched him, offered a gentle inclination of her head. No anger, no lecture, just that quiet acceptance that seemed to belong to someone who had nothing to prove. The traveler retreated, shoulders sagging with the weight of his apology. Then he scurried away, disappearing into the swirl of passengers. Later that afternoon, Julia found herself at a makeshift press gathering near the arrivals hall. A few reporters gathered, eager for a statement. Cameras aimed, microphones hovered. She stood calmly, wearing the same old flats. Her only concession to the setting was her flight cap tucked under her arm. One reporter asked her to comment on how she remained so calm in the face of the storm. She let the question hang, scanning the crowd with mild eyes as if deciding how much to share. Then she answered quietly, "I used to clean these gates. Now I fly out of them. Whatever job you do, you deserve to be treated with respect." The reporter scribbled her words, sensing a story beyond the heroic landing, a story about the assumptions people make. She offered no further elaboration, no grand tale of her background or the hardships she overcame. She simply left it at that, then excused herself to catch the next briefing with airport officials. Days passed, and the airport installed a small plaque above the employee entrance, a thoughtful gesture from the management team. It read, "Any quiet stranger might be a hero in uniform. Honor everyone." No official reference to Julia's name, but everyone understood the plaque's origin. Staff would pass under it daily, reminded that appearances could be deceiving. The flight attendant who once mocked Julia confessed to her colleagues that she felt a gnawing guilt every time she stepped through that door. The lounge guard, demoted for a week, worked in arrivals for a while, greeting travelers with a new humility. The memory of Julia's calm face standing in worn clothes lingered with them all. In quiet corners of the airport, older employees remembered seeing Julia years ago, pushing cleaning carts, wiping seats with the same unflinching composure. Rumor had it she came from a powerful family but chose to earn her stripes humbly. Some recalled her saving money for pilot training, working double shifts. She never bragged or demanded special treatment. Over time, she rose to become an accomplished pilot. That backstory circulated in whispers told by the older custodians who recognized her from long ago. The details varied, but the theme remained the same. She never used her family's name, never flaunted wealth. She just showed up, did her work, learned to fly. Eventually, the rumors quieted, overshadowed by her more recent heroism in saving the flight. The airport discovered a subtle transformation. Staff who once sneered at people with old bags or worn clothes became more attentive. Security lines saw fewer sneers. Gate agents offered warmer greetings. The shift wasn't dramatic but real enough to notice. A hush replaced some of the casual contempt. People spoke of the Julia effect half-joking. For Julia herself, none of these changes demanded her attention. She continued her schedule, co-piloting or captaining flights in and out of that bustling terminal, wearing her once-scorned outfit with pride. The old backpack remained a constant companion, battered but functional, every fray a testament to her journey. Sometimes she'd cross paths with a pilot or a staff member who recognized her name from the news. Their posture would change, their voice soften. She'd return a nod, say a polite, "Good morning," and continue. The hush in those encounters was reminiscent of the hush in a cockpit during final checks, tense yet brimming with unspoken respect. The wealthy traveler might have returned for another flight eventually, but if he did, he kept his distance, thoroughly humbled by the memory of that day. Months later, the airline organized a small ceremony to honor crew members who handled emergencies well. Julia was invited, though she nearly declined. She disliked the spotlight. Ultimately, she attended wearing plain slacks and her pale shirt, flight cap in hand. A handful of executives offered speeches about her courageous mid-Atlantic landing. She listened, face composed, adding no flourish to their praise. When asked to speak, she repeated what she'd said at the airport press gathering, that respect belongs to everyone, from the janitor to the pilot. She gazed at the assembled staff. Some who had humiliated her that day were among them, and let her words rest. Their expressions revealed how deeply her message resonated. She ended with a simple note: "We fly together and we land together." Applause followed, but she didn't linger, stepping away from the podium as soon as courtesy allowed. Over time, the story of Julia Mason circulated beyond the airport. People in the city repeated it at dinner parties, using it as an example of how one shouldn't judge by appearances. Some said she was from an influential background, that her family owned stakes in multiple ventures. Others claimed her lineage traced back to a famous aviation pioneer. The details blurred. All that endured was the core truth: she carried herself with the humility and discipline that had guided her from cleaning floors to steering aircraft. She never used her name to force respect, she simply commanded it by her actions. Back in the terminal, staff resumed normal operations, though an undercurrent of caution remained. Each time a quietly dressed traveler approached, security no longer rushed to dismiss them. Each time a flight crew lounge entrance saw someone with a worn bag, staff hesitated before turning them away. The hush that accompanied these moments was the hush left in Julia's wake, like the calm after an aircraft's final approach. Nobody wanted to repeat the mistake of misjudging a potential hero. One late evening, well after the bustle had died down, Julia walked through the dim corridor where janitors methodically polished floors. She offered them a slight nod of acknowledgement. A faint memory touched her, a younger version of herself, kneeling by a row of chairs, scrubbing off scuff marks, quietly dreaming of the skies. She paused, listening to the hum of a vacuum. Then she continued to the staff exit, flight cap tucked under her arm. She had a flight the next morning, a routine route she'd handled countless times. The overhead lamps cast long shadows, but her footsteps were steady, each step echoing the discipline she carried. When she reached the employee parking lot, the dull glow of security lights revealed a small figure waiting by a car. The flight attendant, who had once ridiculed her, stood there fidgeting. Upon seeing Julia, she approached, voice trembling with nerves. I wanted to say sorry," she managed. "I didn't know who you were." Julia studied her for a heartbeat, then offered a nod. The flight attendant hesitated. "Thank you for that day. You saved all our lives." Julia said nothing, her silence gentle but firm. The attendant, tears pricking her eyes, murmured a final apology, then turned and hurried away. Julia exhaled, placed her bag on the passenger seat of her old car, and slid behind the wheel. She ignited the engine headlights, slicing the dimness, and drove off into the quiet roads outside the airport. The hush of that ride carried her home, where another day of flight instructions and logs awaited. The next dawn, she was back in the cockpit, triple-checking instruments, feeling the plane's potential under her hands. Strangers boarded in blissful ignorance of her story. Some might see her attire and think she was just a staff member riding along. That didn't matter. She had always believed in letting skill speak louder than words. As the aircraft taxied away from the gate, she glimpsed the terminal windows. A faint reflection showed her own face, half obscured by the flight deck's gleam. She lifted her old pilot's cap, setting it in place. The hush of pre-takeoff routines fell upon them, and soon they soared into the sky. Down below, the airport continued its busy cycle, staff crossing paths, travelers rushing through lines. But a plaque still hung at the employee entrance. Any quiet stranger might be a hero in uniform. Honor everyone. That sign would remain a quiet testament to the day Julia Mason made a terminal bow without uttering a single shout. The hush lingers in the hearts of those who witness real composure. It reminds them to look deeper, to handle each unknown person with kindness. Julia's story doesn't end with parades or media tours, only the steady pulse of flight schedules and the open horizon. She lives by the vow she once made, never to flaunt what she is, never to forget where she came from. And in that vow, an entire airport found humility. In the hush after a safe landing, people learn that appearances aren't the final measure. In the hush of the final gate check, a uniform might be hidden behind a simple shirt. In the hush of a busy concourse, respect can still rise above judgment. In the hush of every new day, Julia Mason walks forward, letting silence speak her truth.